Yes, I mean, if you ask me whether the relationship with nature is important and people who are deprived of it have some sort of a deficit, and there is in fact I mean, we're inventing conditions all the time, but there is now something called nature deficit disorder, and it's real. Um, I would say very profoundly so. There is now an enormous amount of evidence of various kinds that people who are brought up in a wholly urban environment and have no connection with nature have many kind of problems, higher levels of anxiety, depression, aggression, anger, cognitive impairments. They're not able to think and concentrate in the way that otherwise they might be, relationship disorders, and generally dysfunctional people. So it is very important, and I'm a patron of a trust called the Fathom Trust, the purpose of which is to help people from backgrounds where they have no contact either with nature or the way of life that would involve working with animals and the traditions of the countryside, to take them to a place where they can begin to understand this and actually have effects on their mental health. It does more than that. It takes stressed out professionals and helps them back into a more normal and fulfilled frame of mind. But it is a very important thing. And in the writing of The Master and His Emissary, I came across a very large body of literature that suggests that our relations with one another are becoming impoverished, and that this is part of why there is so much mental illness. And I presented a lot of that information in what is effectively the last chapter of that book. And there are some interesting studies on immigrants going into America who come from traditional backgrounds where they tend to eat together, worship together, know one another, share one another's lives. And they arrive contrary to what might be thought from wherever it might be. In America, it's quite often Mexico, with actually a low level of mental illness. After they've been there about 20 years, they begin to have higher levels of mental illness. And after a generation, they share the same very high rates of mental illness of the host population in America. There's also evidence that immigrant communities, such as an Italian community that preserved itself on the east coast of America, despite eating, drinking, smoking in ways that we wouldn't have thought healthy, and not necessarily taking the prescribed amount of exercise, that they had lower levels not just of mental illness but of physical illness, because they had preserved the aspects of their home culture and community, which again shared family, worship, eating together, common values. And this combination of the relationship between ourselves as humans and our relationship with the natural world are two very important relationships that have global effects on our health. But as I discovered, I didn't come to this with any preformed idea that there would be any evidence, but I just thought, let me look if there is any evidence about the effects of what I can only call, it's an unsatisfactory phrase, but a spiritual or religious cast of mind, belief, or culture. And the answer is it has an even greater effect than either of the other two. It is the single most powerful predictor of human happiness, and not having such a relationship with another realm means that you are very much less resilient when facing, as we all do, opposition, hardship, and difficulties in life. One is much more prone to anxiety, depression, and a sense of loneliness. And one is much less able to defend oneself against physical illness as well. So the effect of belonging to a group of people who share a common faith and express it together is stronger than going to the gym every day and stopping smoking and watching your blood pressure. So these things are very, very real. Now, I mean, of course, I've cast it as though these things are utilitarian, because the utilitarian way of thinking is the only way in which we evaluate something. Is this useful or is it not? That's a terribly primitive way of thinking. It is the left hemisphere's only value, utility or pleasure. Pleasure is another form of utility. But the right hemisphere sees the world which has many other values, that it has the really important things like truth, love, beauty, justice, magnanimity, bravery. These things are undervalued these days, but they are incredibly important. So we've moved into a world in which we're told nothing has a meaning. We're isolated behind our screens. We don't have common ways of socializing in the way that earlier, more traditional societies had. And our lives are devoid of, I'm generalizing here widely, and of course it won't apply to many people, but in general, modern urban Western life tends to be deficient in those relationships of society, nature, and the spiritual. And so what you would predict is exactly what we see, an enormous rise in mental health problems. And to put this into perspective, because people say, well, we're much more willing to diagnose them nowadays, and I think that's just a cultural thing. Nobody asked in the past. Well, there is some wonderful research that gets around all of that. The American psychologist Jean Twenge has studied children at a certain age in their mid-teens at school because records have been kept for every class since 1930 through to, I think, 2007 when the study was done. And when you compare, people answered questions about their happiness, their sense of loneliness, all those questions, 100 questions about themselves and how they relate to the world. And so you can objectively, and without the effect of the retrospectoscope, you can see how did they score, how do children now score. And what she found is that children now score 5 to 8 times as high, not 5 to 8% more, which would already be a worry, but 5 to 8 times the score. That is to describe an utterly pathological society.